This is Monica Perez, and we are back with one of our favorite guests, a returning guest, Eric Buchanan, fighting the good fight for people who need some professional help. I want him to tell you about that. But he also does a lot of research and educates us on some things in the history books that aren't always just exactly what they teach you in school. So I love that about him. He's got so much scholarly integrity and he really puts the work in. So thank you, Eric. Today we're going to talk about the progressive era. So strap on your tanks, folks. We are going deep with the dive master, Eric Buchanan. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Monica, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm great, thank you. And I always like to start the show by you just telling people who you are and what you do and how they can reach you if they need your services. They've gotten to know you that as someone they could trust. So why don't you tell them if they need you, how they can reach you, and then we'll get into the meat of the matter.
Sure. Thanks, Monica. So, hi, everybody. Eric Buchanan and Associates is my law firm in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We help people all over the United States who've been denied long-term disability, disability insurance, private disability, ERISA disability benefits. If you have a group policy at work or you bought a policy on your own, we can help if the insurance company is giving you the runaround or not paying your claim. We have 5 attorneys. We work with local attorneys all over the United States, in states where we're not licensed. So we'll help you anywhere in the United States. We also help with life insurance, health insurance, long-term care policies. So if you're denied benefits, or if the insurance company just doesn't give you an answer that you appreciate, or is just taking too long, give us a call, 877-634-2506, or on the World Wide Web at buchanandisability.com.
That's great. I know lots of people have problems like that, and it's very frustrating. And, people who don't like lawyers don't have good lawyers on their team. That's what I always think. Like, I love lawyers because I know some good ones and they can help you. So that's awesome. And I also am excited to talk about this subject today, the progressive era, which I have always felt was a plot by big business to regulate and keep newcomers out or put up regulatory barriers to entry. That's my very simplistic overview, but I think it gets a little more complicated than that. I know that you're going to take the position of integrity and you're going to bring some facts. We don't always have the exact same ideology, but I would love for you to just you can start from the beginning, how we got here. We were talking about the populist moment and movement last time we talked, but if you want to give us backstory or you just want to respond to what I said, take it away.
Yeah, sure. So maybe let me give you my not so carefully worded sort of semi-agreement with you. It was a plot, but it was a plot by the academic big government people who wanted to just take over.
Really?
That's actually my short answer. That big business didn't like the progressives either, unless they really were working hand in hand. But I think that kind of came more later. I think the idea of progressivism was to gain political power by promising the American people that we can solve all your problems, that we can create the utopia. It wasn't quite communism because they still use words about democracy. They still occasionally would say something about the Constitution, although I'm going to really get into how much they really didn't like the Constitution and how much people like Woodrow Wilson undermined it. But the idea of progressivism was the movement that happened in the late 1800s, where the United States was changing from a agricultural nation to an industrial nation, that we were changing to an urban nation at the same time. We kind of had the populist moment where the farmers who didn't want things to change too much recognized that they had a certain amount of political power in America. It was a democracy, and while they still had large numbers, they could influence the elections. And they did on the local level. They somewhat did on a national level. And eventually, William Jennings Bryan was very much a populist, and he ran for president on the Democrat ticket 3 times around the turn of the century, never got elected. What progressivism is go ahead in another 10, 15, 20 years, and you have Woodrow Wilson running in 1912, and Woodrow Wilson actually brings in William Jennings Bryan to be his Secretary of State. And so he sort of absorbs the populist movement into the progressive movement. But I think you really need to take one more step back, and then you and I can have the conversation. I know you like to ask me questions, but let's kind of start this. I think the first progressive president was really Teddy Roosevelt. I think it's important to recognize that. And he was not elected for his first term in office, but he served almost 4 years when William McKinley was shot, and Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 and served out a full term and then was reelected. And he very much believed in more power going to the president. His whole idea of a bully pulpit was, I'm going to use the influence that I have as president to try to make significant changes. And he considered himself to be a progressive. And so what happened over the next couple of decades is how progressivism kind of became the standard is where I think America took an interesting turn.
Okay, so my source that I went to first was Mises.org, which is, of course, the hardcore libertarian source. And I did not realize it, but Murray Rothbard had an unfinished manuscript called The Progressive Era that Patrick Newman, a professor in Florida, put together as a book and has done his own work on it. And I was listening to a lecture of his, and he hit the Teddy Roosevelt stuff, and he said, I don't even think he implied it. I think he said it outright that Teddy Roosevelt was kind of in bed with the Morgan interests, and that the Morgan interests, so some trusts and the trust busting or whatever, some of the progressive movement was directed towards the enemies of Morgan or the enemies of Teddy Roosevelt personally, that it got very personal. It was used selectively. And I kind of don't like it when Teddy Roosevelt is portrayed as some person of integrity, because I feel like every time I dig into what he's done, he's always got something going on behind the scenes. And I thought that would be something, I know you're not afraid of that idea, but I'm not sure if you agree with it.
Yeah. So in defense of Teddy Roosevelt, he was the first president of the United States who had been any kind of a city official. He'd been the police commissioner for New York City before being the governor. And so he came into the White House with this new idea of, we're now an urban country, and he had seen what happens in those urban places. So I think he did make some hay in the idea that he was going to tear down things like Tammany Hall, and some of the other corruption that was going on, where the big cities had become run by party bosses. What you and I know in history about Tammany Hall in New York City was also happening in Baltimore, Chicago, some other big cities. They had very corrupt city governments, and if you didn't get along with the party, you didn't have a chance. If you didn't pay off the party bosses, you didn't have a chance. So he came in with that background where he had to kind of break that up and fight against it, and that was sort of his claim to fame, was fighting against that kind of corruption.
But I always feel like when a politician comes out as taking power away from someone corrupt, they maybe, I would say my default position is that they're just giving it to someone else. So perhaps he was trying to, what I call, upsource it, take all that power. And yes, it was corrupt at the local level, but it's bigger and badder at a higher level. And I think of Giuliani. Giuliani broke up the Italian mob and paved the way for the Russian mob, which some would argue was worse. So what do you think about, do you think he was just trying to get a bigger position and rob those? Because like when I was in investment banking, like the individual bankers used to have the clients, and the banks didn't like that because they had to really pay them. And then what they did was they made it so that there was always teams or whatever. They took the power away from the local banker and put it to the industry head.
Yeah, so I would argue that in Teddy Roosevelt's case, that it was, a lot of it was what's the thing, what are the things I can pay attention to that are going to get me more political power, they're going to get me reelected. It wasn't necessarily, I'm not, picking and choosing which big companies to break up into the early antitrust, the trust busting, the monopolies. Yeah, there was probably some of that the companies that were more politically supportive of him probably got less attention. I wouldn't be surprised at that analysis. But another part of that is, as the guy who walked softly but carried a big stick, and talked softly and carried a big stick, and he could pick and choose what companies that he wanted to start pointing out were not very good for the economy, were not very good for the country. And he got sort of his political popularity by going out and selling himself as protecting the public from these big evil corporations and some of the stuff that was happening. And so one of the defenses of the politicians during the progressive age, and I'm by no means a progressive, I just want to,
you're right, I know,
kind of at least,
and it means something different now.
It does, but I would not have definitely been a progressive in 1900. If you and I'd been having this conversation in 1920 and looking back at the last 25 years, we would not be. I don't think either one of you would be even close to being progressives. But one of the things we sort of have to recognize is something was going to happen in the
Yeah.
country when we went from mostly agricultural after the Civil War to now we have airplanes, we have electricity, we have railroads that go across the country, we have these big multi-state corporations. And for the last 150 years, the idea had been that the corporation could be incorporated in the state of New York or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or the state of Alabama. Well, what about a corporation that was incorporated in New York, but also the same people owned a similar corporation in every other state across the country and they had a railroad running across? Which state would regulate that? What if you had a big the meat packing industry getting together and like buying up all the railroad supply lines that would take the cattle to Chicago or to St. Louis or to Kansas City? And so that kind of stuff made sense to the American people who had just kind of had their populist moment. They still wanted the government, and this is the I think where you and I kind of politically agree. What happens to people is they've been sold a bill of goods that the government's going to solve their problems. Remember, just a couple of things as background. Right around this time, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. People still learn about that, but basically, it goes into gross details, just really nasty what happened in the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So it was easy when that was like one of the most popular books to sell people the idea, well, the government needs to come in and start a Food and Drug Act.
But don't you think that was propaganda for that movement? Like that wasn't just this guy genuinely exposing. I mean, it's criticized for being yellow journalism, really. But
Yeah,
some people say it was underestimated what was going on.
Yeah, I would. So the idea of yellow journalism was still very popular. We just come through the Spanish American War. We still had Citizen Kane, the guy who was the head of all the newspapers, and
Yes, Hearst.
yeah, William Randolph Hearst fighting against Pulitzer, and they were both very much into yellow journalism around this time. Later on, Teddy Roosevelt coined the term, somebody who was always trying to just find problems and doing investigative journalism. The problem was some of the investigative journalists were actually finding stuff,
Yeah,
and especially and including in his administration. So back to your question, was what was going on in the meatpacking industry in Chicago? Was it pretty gross? Well, yeah. If you went in and looked at what if you go today to what happens in a meatpacking factory, you could describe it
I've
as
heard
pretty
that. Yeah,
gross, right? And
yeah,
it's way cleaner than it was back
yeah.
then. Did we need to clean it up some? Yeah. You think about what in 1900 to 1910, what did we know about germ theory?
Ugh, don't start with that, Eric. Because I was gonna say what they do with vaccines is they wait until the the illness is on the wane, then they introduce the vaccine and they say, look, so I would argue that, and I've heard that the meat industry, the actual cartel, which had about 30% of the market in the before the antitrust acts and stuff, were cleaning it up. Like it was in their interest to clean it up. They were making innovations. There was competition, and to you can't be sure that regulations is what makes the difference. And of course, I would say it's unlikely that regulation actually just takes the credit.
Yeah, so the libertarian answer, or at least a
Yeah,
limited government answer, would be I'm going to open a company and I'm going to tell you how clean my meatpacking plants
yeah,
are. And
exactly.
if you want to buy the meat that's not been dragged across the floor beside the outhouse,
Yeah,
literally that's the kind of stuff that was covered in Upton Sinclair's The
yes,
Jungle. That it was really, really, really gross. And once he did that, a lot of people sort of got careful about what meat they were buying. There were
great.
places in Chicago where you could get actually raw meat that was served as a delicacy, and he traced where some of that had literally been dragged across the floor right beside the outhouse in the factory and
Uh,
it was never even cleaned up before it was packed. And that's the kind of stuff that was in Upton Sinclair's Jungle. So in an era where people have already gone through this populist moment where they think I want the government to help solve my problems, there were a lot of people that were still buying into this idea that the government was going to be the solution, and it was really hard to sell people on the idea that this stuff will work itself out in the market. And when you have big corporations that have started having to these big monopolies, it's hard to convince people that the government's not going to be the solution. Now, let me talk as a libertarian for a second. The other thing that was happening, why did the robber barons have so much success in the United States? What was another thing? Why were they so protected? Is something that people don't look at in history. Do you know why they were so protected? Why they were able to do what they were able to do?
Well, I thought that JP Morgan had Teddy Roosevelt in his pocket, but maybe
How
it
about
wasn't that.
tariffs?
Oh, yes, yes,
Yeah,
very high tariffs,
so
yes.
the United States until about 1913 had somewhere between a 25 and 50% tariff on all foreign products,
Isn't that
all.
pathetic?
For
Like,
but
we,
we
as
did
the cutting edge of industrialization, should have that?
well, that's how we got to be the cutting the
Okay.
original idea
Yeah,
was
some
around the
people like it,
Civil
yeah.
War, and after the Civil War, the argument was politically, let's
Yeah.
put tariffs in place so that American industry is not undercut by British and German industry or French
Yeah, it's
industry.
not illogical. I mean, I understand that the whole free trade thing is a very libertarian concept and I generally embrace it, but the reality of how other countries work and you have a captive consumer base that's so large it could sustain any industry and it may be in your long-term interest if a country acts as a unit with its people and have aligned interests and make decisions that are in good faith. I don't think it's illogical.
Yeah, and so ultimately what happened in the United States though is our industry got so good between say 1885 and 1915 that we were able to compete dollar for dollar, factory for factory, efficiency for efficiency with the Germans, with the British. We didn't need the high tariffs anymore to protect our industry. But because we still had high tariffs during that window, it gave the opportunity for the big.
Hmm. Eric, you're totally frozen for me. Are you the only one? Am I frozen? Ah, this is not good. Eric, Eric, Eric. Not good. I'm going to leave and come back. Eric left too, I guess. Monica's not frozen, just Eric. Okay, thank you. All right, so he's gone. So I guess he's going to leave and come back as well. Thanks everybody for coming, by the way. I really like to see you guys in the corners. Should we have a cocktail party? Do people want to have a cocktail party someday? Oh, is it Mardi Gras today? Snap. I generally give up drinking on Lent. Hmm. Which is it's kind of paradoxical or whatever because you're allowed to not do your Lenten thing on Sundays. So I give up like drinking and using vulgarity. So like just on Sundays, I'm a drunk vulgarian. Although my mother taught me because my mother is like loosey gooseyest. She she literally prays for 4 hours a day. But what she will do is uh Eric said he's trying to log back in. She likes to give she likes to take she likes to quit gambling. She likes to bet on the horses and she likes to quit gambling during Lent. But if something happens, I mean, it's not the Kentucky Derby, but if there's something big that happens or you take her to the races or whatever, she'll tack on like a day. Maybe she'll give her a penalty, but tack on 2 days, something like that after the fact. So her Lent will extend into the Easter season, which is probably not cool. Probably not supposed to do that, but she's loosey goosey. So I've learned that from her. If we wanted to have a party, I can have a party, just tack another day on to the end. So I could even, um, like for every day I take off, add a week, or a week thing. This is so true. Did you hear about Bishop O'Connell? I mean, the priests on Sunday were so broken up, they had no idea what had happened. Apparently, the husband of his housekeeper was arrested, saying that he thought she owed him money or something. He owed her money or something like that. I mean, it seems like nutty to me. And I wondered if something was nefarious was going on with this guy, but he was supposedly just absolutely dedicated his life to the poor. My pastor worked with him in the early days of his mission in the poorest uh, parish in LA. I mean, it was really, really devastating. So you guys, uh, white Catholics always find a way to be flexible. JC, come on. We have to go to purgatory and stuff. Like, it is way harder for us to get into that. You gotta be a little bit flexible because it's too stressful. Eric, we've been just talking. Lent is tomorrow, right? So,
Yeah, today's Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, the last day of Carnival, whatever you want to call it. Yep.
so we were thinking we should have a cocktail party. I like to have a cocktail party once in a while, but I give up drinking for Lent usually. But we were also just saying that, whatever. Sometimes I'll like take the thing I give up and push it to whatever after Lent. I'll take a couple of more days and just so I can squeeze in some fun during Lent.
Yeah, yeah.
But maybe that's just wrong. I don't know.
Well, sorry about the crash. That's the second time that's
Yeah.
happened lately for me. I have ordered a new computer about 3 months ago, and
Oh
I'm
my
still
gosh.
supply chain
Wow.
problems. So sorry about that. Hopefully it won't happen again.
Do you have a router in your office? Can you plug directly into the Ethernet? I mean, not right this second, but in the future, it's just a cheap cable.
Yeah, I can. I will. I think I actually am, but that's what I'm going to find
Oh,
out.
okay. If you look at your computer, if there's like a lightning port sticking out of it, a white Ethernet cable, then you're there. If not, you're not.
Yeah, I will check
Which
on
is
that.
fine. No
Yeah.
big deal.
Yeah.
It's just I've been through this before and it's worth being tethered. So oh, there you go. See, Cat Duckness, thank you. And Eric, are you not Episcopalian?
I was raised Episcopalian. I'm now Presbyterian. My mom's still Episcopalian. I think I've been confirmed as both Episcopalian and Presbyterian. So
Wow, you
yes,
get to get
I have dual
confirmed
citizenship.
twice. That's funny. My mother
Yeah.
always said like the Anglicans were Catholics with divorce, Episcopalians were American Anglicans, and Presbyterian was just like one step removed from Episcopalian. She said there's some kind of like statusy hierarchy associated with all that. But that's my mother. All she thinks about is religion. So, okay. So he was joking. That's good. Okay. So let's get back on track. And that little bonus will be edited out, no doubt. From the audio. Okay. So we were saying what really crashed was that I had put up and a comment from JC that said big processing facilities are much more likely to result in contamination and cutting corners than a small sustainable farm. And he was also saying that local farmers have the means today to cleanly cut their own meat or hire somebody to cut. This is a big issue right now. The particular thing people are sensitive about is the meat thing, because there was an Amish farmer who was got into trouble for having a very clean and humane way of processing his meat for people to have stuff that they didn't want highly processed. And this train derailment seems to be hitting that area of the country, and people are suspicious about it. But let's get back on track. Do you remember where we got derailed?
Well, we were addressing his question very quickly. If you look back at the progressive era, what was changing back then so quickly was all this industrialization, and the idea of refrigerated train cars had come along during this time period, or just simply even in the early part of trains and around the turn of the century, that you could just put the cattle on a train and take them pretty far. And then that's why they have the elevated train tracks in New York City. They would take the cows all the way down to the meatpacking district and slaughter them down inside the city. The Highland high-rise park, or whatever it's called, that's that elevated walkway. That was the old train tracks to take live animals down to the meatpacking district before they had refrigeration. But the industrialization of America made it so we weren't having conversations in 1900 about whether the farmers could do this more efficiently. We were trying to figure out how to get all this food to the big cities.
Right. Okay. My dad was a meat cutter in Brooklyn, and he used to go to that, the butchers. Like he said, people would call him a butcher. He's like, I'm not a butcher. I don't kill. But he would go to the butchers and, or whatever, wherever that warehousing was in the meat packing districts in New York. Also around that time, another author you mentioned, Updike, I would also mention Steinbeck wrote East of Eden, which was that was the central, or one of the pivotal moments in that book was the refrigerated truck, I think, with the lettuce in it.
Yeah.
So this was what they were doing at the time, and that is something that I've been learning about, is that they were innovating on their own. It was in their interests. And I also find that regulations don't actually solve problems unless you're already rich enough and progressive enough, like actually progressed enough to solve the problem anyway. You can put all the regulations you want in Haiti and you still have buildings collapsing in earthquakes because they just can't afford to do it. So they don't do it. And then
Or
you just do a little bribing and it's over.
you can have the same conversation about communism. You can give the means of production to the workers all you want to, but if no one's ever built a factory, how are you going to do that? You can't just impose those rules. You have to have capitalism before you find out what the next step is.
Well, that's what Marx said.
That's what
He said
Marx said. Yeah.
capitalism gave way, then you just steal the factories from everybody. But I mean, I guess he missed the whole point about maintenance, which makes me think that he wasn't serious about it. But whatever.
But
Okay.
his followers, unfortunately, were
Yes.
way too often.
Yes, totally agree.
So speaking of his early followers, let's kind of talk about this progressive. What ended up happening was Teddy Roosevelt was pretty progressive, and we can argue about whether, or we can at least explore historically whether it was all corruption, some corruption, or whether he was a little
Right.
bit corrupt. I think I would say a little bit at least, but he also was a pretty good president in a lot of ways. If you want somebody who's going to go solve problems, increase the size of the Navy, the Panama Canal, those kind of things were going on under Teddy Roosevelt. The interesting thing that happened that kind of gets us really into the heart of the progressive era is after Teddy Roosevelt served out the rest of McKinley's term and his main term in 1908, he had promised he wasn't going to run again in 1904 when he was reelected. And so he leaves William Howard Taft, who'd been his Secretary of Defense, to become the next president. So Taft runs as a Republican. And over those 4 years, Roosevelt and Taft start having more and more disagreements. And Taft ends up not being as progressive as Teddy Roosevelt had hoped he would be. So the 1912 election, I think, is a really kind of watershed moment in American history. And I'd kind of like to just give me like 3 minutes to tell that history really
Take your
quickly.
time. Yeah, I'm interested.
So
I have to get my ideology out there because I get a lot of feedback. People send me emails just like, that's ridiculous. There's no regulations. I'm like, I get it. But this is,
this is the history of how we got to this point. I would argue as a libertarian, if we hadn't gone through this progressive era, we wouldn't actually have the idea to show how it can go wrong and what happens if we let people think that they can solve all the problems with government. And this is kind of where it all really gets started. So in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt decides that Taft has not really been progressive enough. So Teddy Roosevelt goes and decides he's going to run again for the nomination of the Republican Party. So it ends up being Taft versus Teddy Roosevelt running in 1912 to get the Republican nomination. And Woodrow Wilson was sort of handpicked by the people in the Democrat Party to see if they could have somebody they could manipulate. So they got the guy who was this very academic, nerdy college professor to go run to become governor of New Jersey. He'd never held office before, and he wins that election in 1910 and immediately starts running for president of the United States. Starts kind of doing the stuff to set it up, and turns out on the Democrat side with Woodrow Wilson, the sort of behind the scenes smoke filled room guys thought they could control him, and they absolutely could not. He had his own ideas on government, and he'd been writing stuff going back in the 1880s and 1890s on the theory of government. We'll get into that in a little bit because I think that's really important where he comes from. But what ends up happening in 1912 is the Republicans, for one of the first time, are instituting this new idea called primaries. And they have primaries in about half the states. And about half the states that have primaries overwhelmingly go for Teddy Roosevelt. They get to the convention, and at the convention, they hadn't yet set up the rules that the primaries were binding. So the delegates at the Republican National Convention in 1912 end up being controlled by Taft and the old Republican Party guys. They end up ignoring the results of all these primaries and nominating Taft to be president. Roosevelt gets so upset, he goes with some of the other leading Republicans, and they go out and storm out, start their own party. They call it the Progressive Party. It's also called the Bull Moose Party. And they end up splitting in the election. They end up splitting the vote of people that would have voted Republican. And we can go ahead, Monica.
I think Trump might do that to DeSantis.
I think that's a real possibility. This is the last time it's happened. So What's important to understand about this is I think Teddy Roosevelt should have been nominated because he'd won all the primaries. They just didn't have the primaries as a binding mechanism yet. They
Oh,
didn't. They
interesting.
didn't. So they couldn't enforce that he won the primaries. That's how I think he was cheated. He thought he was cheated. So he goes out and starts this third party. They end up going to the election. Taft only wins 2 states. The Republican nominee had only won 2 states. Now, remember, historically, we talked about during the progressive era, no Democrat had won back to back terms, and only one Democrat had been elected since the Civil War. Grover Cleveland was the only Democrat who had been elected since before the Civil War. And so the Republicans have just had uninterrupted success. So in 1912, the Republicans
Wow.
end up splitting, and so the Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party, ends up getting 88 electoral votes. It won a fair number of states. But what happens is Woodrow Wilson gets 42% of the vote across the country, which makes him the winner in almost every state. And he ends up getting 435 electoral votes, but with only 42% of the vote.
Like
Uh,
Clinton.
yeah, Teddy
Clinton
Roosevelt
was
gets,
hit by third party.
yeah. So Teddy Roosevelt gets like 28% of the vote. Taft gets like 23% of the vote. And Eugene Debs, the socialist, got 6% of the vote. 6% of the vote. He didn't get any electoral votes. So if you add all that up, 51% of the American public wanted somebody who had been a Republican, either Taft or Teddy Roosevelt. But because they split the vote everywhere, Woodrow Wilson gets in. If you count up everybody who called themselves a progressive, everybody that's not Taft, it was 70% of the American people wanted somebody who was a progressive. Even Taft ran on something that he called the conservative progressive platform.
Okay. But how powerful was the president then? For something like that to happen, there shouldn't be a position that could be super powerful that only represents a minority.
So this is where Woodrow Wilson comes in. So Woodrow Wilson, who'd been writing uh, thesis, he was arguably the first ever quote political scientist to be president. Johns Hopkins University had actually introduced the concept of political science as a major, and that's where he got his PhD in the 1880s. His first book, which was his doctorate, was called Congressional Governance, and he was arguing in the late 1800s all the way up through 1910 in his academic writings for a powerful presidency that was not limited by a constitution, that we should have a system much more like Great Britain, where you have a parliament and you have sort of a understood constitution, but no firm constitution. So what ultimately happens, and I got some interest, if you start looking at what Woodrow Wilson had to say about this stuff, let me just give you a couple quotes from his writings when he gets in. One of his quotes was, "The Declaration of Independence did not mention the questions of the day. It is of no consequence to us." He
Wow, it's a
what
foundational document. I understand that it's not legally binding, but it is the foundational document.
It gets better. He says, here's what he says while he's touring the country as governor of New Jersey. So in 1911, he hasn't officially announced he's running for president. He goes to the Jefferson Club in Los Angeles and says, "The rhetorical introduction of the Declaration of Independence is the least part of it, the part that talks about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface." He said that to the Jefferson Club. All right, here's what he said in one of his speeches about Americanism. "The Constitution was not made to fit us like a straitjacket. Its elasticity lies its chief greatness."
But it's not that it had elasticity, it's that it wasn't it wasn't that restrictive. It wasn't a straitjacket.
So what happened? So what his political philosophy boils down to, and there's different ways you can talk about this, but in essence, is this: that for good government to work, it has to be efficient, and a government should not fight amongst itself. And so the whole idea of a separation of powers was the founding fathers had written a document and a constitution for their time, and it shouldn't be applied to modern
No,
times.
he was a technocrat and a centralizer.
He was
That's
absolutely he was a
that's
tech.
timeless. That definitely goes back to the Romans.
Yeah. So When he ran in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt ran on the platform of the new national platform, new nationalism, which was actually for a strong federal government to address problems like this, big monopolies and the industrialization, how dirty stuff was getting, the railroads, that kind of stuff. Woodrow Wilson, when he ran, he actually said, I'm running on a platform called the New Freedom. And his original idea during his campaign was that the states would have more control over these big corporations and the federal government would have less of a role. But the way we would break them up is we would make sure the states were going to take a bigger role and control each corporation. As soon as he got into office, he promptly forgot all that. He
That's not
start
actually that would be kind of unconstitutional because one of the main reasons that we're together was for the commerce. And so like that was a big problem with health insurance and Obamacare and stuff is that the states regulated it and did not allow cross-border business to be done. So I can see that is actually the only thing that the Constitution would have give you the freedom to do. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, so if you remember Woodrow Wilson's background, he was born in the South in 1856, which means he was 4 years old when the Civil War started, which means he was 9 years old when the Civil War ended. His dad was a Presbyterian minister, and they lived in Virginia, in South Carolina, and in Georgia, and in North Carolina as his father moved around. He was raised in the South during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Those were his formative years. He was the first Southern president since the Civil War. He was the first Democrat who was not a Northern limited government guy. So here he comes. He's a Southern Democrat. He's the first president who went to political science
but
university.
The Southern Democrats were the segregationists and such, right?
Absolutely. There's a whole nother layer to this that Woodrow Wilson, for example, as when the Republicans in charge as president for most of the time since the Civil War, they had fully integrated the federal government. One of the ways that African Americans in the United States could advance pretty securely in the United States and actually demonstrate their abilities and not be segregated against, not be discriminated against, was if they were employed by the federal government. Woodrow Wilson absolutely changed all that.
Wow.
He resegregated the federal government. Now totally. And his argument was that he used the machine metaphor, that government should work like a machine. And he used this as an argument against the checks and balances of the different divisions of government. You shouldn't have a separation of powers because government's like a machine and you don't have a machine fight against itself. And another way that the government work as machine, if you integrated the races, his argument was if you allowed Black people and white people to work together because of their inherent differences, and he was kind of careful in sometimes to say because of their inherent, that they were worse, that they weren't as good, but he ultimately was really implying that Black people were part of the traditional Republican corruption that had been happening over the last 60 years. That was his argument. The Republicans had been in power so much that their Black stooges,
carpetbagging and stuff?
More like the Tammany Hall type corruption in government, right? That you're just giving away jobs and you want people that are going to do those jobs to do them in a biased way in favor of your political.
I thought that was the Irish people.
It was, so
my forebears.
It may have been. The point
I'm sure.
The point is whether that's true or not. And I don't think any of that really was that. Well, there was obviously some corruption.
We don't know. Right. Okay.
What Woodrow Wilson did for political gain was to argue that the Black people that were in the federal government were really just the corrupt stooges of the corrupt Republicans. And that's why they needed to be segregated out. That and the idea that when you have people of mixed races working together, it's going to create friction. And then he goes back to his mechanics metaphor. In this early industrial age, what is the one thing you don't want an engine to do? You don't want it to have too much friction. And that was his argument to resegregate the civil service. In reality, he was racist as hell. I mean, he had what's the name of the movie? The Birth of a Nation, the old black and white movie. That basically it's an ass kissing movie of the KKK. I mean, it talks about how great the KKK was. He showed that at the White House, and he said it was the greatest movie ever made. That's Woodrow Wilson.
Wow, so that is not how he is portrayed. I mean, every once in a while, someone will make some noise about him, but he just, I don't know. I confused him with Chamberlain sometimes. He was Hitler appeaser, but they just seem like Casper Milquetoast. Like they're, complacent or whatever, but not him, I guess.
So in a lot of ways, it was the soft language of big government, the soft language of here's the way this is going to work. And so the way he would talk about these things is, for example, this is what he said when he was president in 1913. The Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with this theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. He was opposed to the Constitution. He was opposed to the founding fathers.
Wow.
He wanted to unseparate the government, and he wanted to have the government answer to the will of the people. And there was two big ways to do this: a powerful executive that was involved in the legislative process. He brought back the direct State of the Union speeches, for example. From Thomas Jefferson until Woodrow Wilson, the president would only send a letter to Congress because of the separation of powers. Woodrow Wilson went over and started giving the State of the Union speech in person for the first time since John Adams. He would go over and spearhead legislation that he wanted to get through. He also thought that the administrative state was a fantastic idea.
And it's totally unconstitutional, which I learned on the first day of administrative law.
Yeah. So not only unconstitutional, but the idea behind it, this is where he goes a far afield of what the founding fathers thought, and I think where he gets it totally wrong. But this is kind of where we should, we can talk about this a little bit. His idea of the administrative state was you want to separate politics from administration, and that the executive branch should be responsible to whoever elects the executive branch. The president should be responsive to the people, and it's the whole people. And whoever wins the presidency should be able to use that power as much as possible without any constitutional limits getting in the way. And we need these administrative agencies where we're going to have non-political experts, technocrats who are not going to be politically biased, go solve everybody's problems. Go
like
make sure.
He created the deep state. It was right. I mean, that's these bureaucrats who last forever, who underlie without depending, like the elected officials change, but that deep state bureaucracy, I've heard from people who've worked with it, those people don't care at all who's in charge. And it also sounds like he had this idea of kind of serial autocracy, not necessarily inherited autocracy, but an autocrat.
Yeah. And he didn't create it. He brought it over from Germany. So the Germans had already kind of developed these ideas, the Bismarck era in Germany.
Exactly.
But he thought it was a great idea to do in the United States. And this is the kind of stuff that Woodrow Wilson started really pushing for. And the idea is, if you put people in these expert places, they can manage the railroads better. They can manage the food industry better. They can manage whatever it is that you want to regulate for the people, the health industry, whatever it is that these experts can go out and do that. But they are supposed to remain apolitical. They're not supposed to be part of the political machine. And his vision for what America would become would be a better place to live, where it'd be more responsive to the people, but more responsive to the people. Somehow it was sort of in conflict with his own ideas of the president being more responsive to the people and being more powerful, but the administrative state being able to operate on its own. He did that on purpose. He wanted the administrative state to operate on purpose. So he copied the 19th century German social scientist, and here's a great quote: "Modern government should be guided by the administrative agency experts with specialized knowledge beyond the ken of ordinary Americans, and that these experts shouldn't be unduly constrained by ordinary notions of democratic rule or constitutional constraints."
That's blowing my mind.
Yeah, now that's actually in a biography about him, but it's still quoting from part of his
whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously.
It's a critical biography. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So he was definitely the guy who started the administrative state and the person who really brought it to America and really pushed it.
Who was behind him? I mean, he was beholden. Like, he was definitely controlled. Was he as ignorant of being controlled as some people think?
So when he was first elected governor, the party bosses in the Democrat Party sort of identified him as somebody that they could picked to be the next president, the Democrat who would have a chance. After William Jennings Bryan, the populist movement had failed. He tried to run 3 out of the last 4 elections prior to 1912. He was the Democrat nominee. He lost three times. And so the idea was, let's get somebody who's really going to do something special. The president of Princeton, who's got a degree in political science, who's written books on the government, but he's just an academic. We can control him. And the story goes that the day he won the election to be governor in 1910 of New Jersey, he turned around and told the party bosses, let's be clear, I owe you nothing. That's the famous quote from Woodrow Wilson. They still thought that they could control him in 1912, and I don't think they did. I think what they got was this guy who really believes in the idea of this massive administrative state, of a living constitution. He was also one of the people to really bring that out. The idea that we don't follow the text of the Constitution, that we follow the Constitution should be read in the era in which it's being interpreted. In other words, the Constitution is a very flexible document. Those were all Wilson ideas.
Well, what do you think the party bosses wanted, if not that?
I think the party bosses wanted somebody who would be more willing to use the power of government to shut down the big companies that didn't play ball with the Democrats, and to fight against their enemies, and to basically have the political patronage and corruption that the Democrats might want, instead of the Republicans getting the patronage and the corruption. That it was time for the Democrats to have a chance, and they could control him. But they ended up getting somebody. He was an ideologue. He was not that well controlled.
Okay, but they did, when they put Colonel House in there to handle him for the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, to gin up the World War I and stuff. He did, I believe, later say or acknowledge that he was totally manipulated into doing all of that. But that's foreign policy. That's different. That is not what we're talking about today.
And that's a really great point. His number one advisor when he was running, that he trusted, was the future Justice Brandeis. Justice Brandeis, who was appointed in 1916.
Let's talk about constitutional stuff. Keep going.
Yeah, so the first Jewish Supreme Court justice was Justice Brandeis, but Justice Brandeis got his real political start. He was Woodrow Wilson's main advisor, his main guy in 1910 and in 1912. So Brandeis was right there beside Woodrow Wilson talking about this stuff. And one of their famous conversations that was passed down by Brandeis later on is that Woodrow Wilson basically said after he was elected, wouldn't it be ironic if my time as president were interfered with by some kind of foreign crisis? Because his whole goal was to totally reform America into this administrative state, into some modern form of government that wouldn't be bound by the Constitution. He ends up, before even World War I, remember the other two big things that happened was the Mexico was going through a revolution, and Woodrow Wilson kind of screwed up which side we were going to be on. Eventually pissed him off. And eventually in 1915, a guy named Pancho Villa came across the border into Texas and shot up a bunch of Americans, killed something like 50 people. And we ended up sending General Blackjack Pershing down to Mexico to chase Pancho Villa around.
My grandfather fought in that army.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So my actual grandfather, which makes me sound very, very old, but he was very old.
Under Woodrow Wilson, we had that foreign adventure, and under Woodrow Wilson, we ended up basically occupying Haiti because they were not paying off their debts and they were having all kinds of corruption. We went down there and seized the gold from the Haiti bank and basically brought it back to New York and said, no, that's ours. So they didn't have any money anymore. And then in the collapse and the chaos, the Americans, we occupied it so that the Germans wouldn't, because World War I had already started, but we weren't involved. Anyway, bottom line was Woodrow Wilson had some foreign policy stuff that he basically let other people guide him on, and he didn't do so well and got us into World War I eventually. But his domestic stuff, he had this agenda, and the agenda was to essentially, if you were to look at it in his light, to modernize the American government to reflect this modern urban industrial age that we live in.
Man, it was just ideology. It's hard to believe, but I understand that's your position. And I do want to know how he got away with this constitutionally.
So there was the Supreme Court ended up being about a generation behind him. And so what had happened in 1905 is we had the Lochner versus New York case. Lochner versus New York is cases I think you and I would very much like to see that idea brought back. So as a libertarian, the idea that the Constitution says we have the right to contract, So what happened in Lochner versus New York is New York passed a law that said bakers couldn't work for more than 10 hours a day. Not that you had to be paid overtime if you wanted to work more, just flat out, you cannot work more than 10 hours. So if you're trying to put 3 kids through college or whatever, you can't go work 12 hours a day. You can only work 10 hours a day.
What if you
Now,
owned the place?
That's a good question. They couldn't be employed for 10 hours a day, I think
Got it.
is what
Yeah,
the bill
I
was.
think that's right. Yeah.
And if you get into the history of it, it's actually pretty nasty because when a lot of the tenements were built in New York City after the Civil War through the early 1900s, they didn't have very many restaurants and bakeries and places to buy food. They just had all these buildings stacked on top of each other, right beside each other in lower Manhattan. And what people had done in order to feed because the money was there to be made, they were turning the original basements where the sewage lines ran and the water lines ran and the gas lines ran, and you had about a 5-foot ceiling. And in some places, you actually had open pit toilets because they didn't have a separate toilet for the basement. And that's where they were opening these bake shops. That's where the bakers were working there because it was the only place you could build an oven that was so heavy because you couldn't build it on a floor somewhere.
Right.
You had to build
Wow.
it down in the basement. And so multiple buildings were anyway. The conditions were horrible. New York eventually figured they had to regulate it. And one of the first things they did was try to limit the hours that these people could be forced to work in these hot, sweaty, sewage filled basements.
I mean, they weren't forced to work, right?
Well, that's exactly right. The right to say, I want to work this much. So that New York tried to limit to 10-hour work days. It goes to the Supreme Court in 1905. The Supreme Court strikes it down and said, no, those kind of laws violate your inherent constitutional right to the freedom of contract, a right guaranteed in the Constitution and incorporated in the states in the 14th Amendment, so that doesn't pass. And so the Lochner era begins. Well, the Lochner era is going to end during FDR, but we'll talk about a couple other cases that are worth talking about. In 1911, Teddy Roosevelt had started while he was president some proceedings against Standard Oil to break them up, and the Supreme Court ruled in 2 cases that came out the same day, Standard Oil and the American Tobacco case, both of them where the Taft administration had pursued this to try to break up these giant monopolies of Standard Oil, basically owned a huge percentage of the oil business from the oil, from actually drilling for the oil, pumping the oil all the way through change it into petroleum and other products. And then the American Tobacco, that was the Duke family. They bought up something like 250 tobacco companies. And the guy who owned American Tobacco was the first one to really use the cigarette rolling machine. And that started making, so it went from being able to, it took a human being about an hour to roll 200 cigarettes if they were really good and trained and could do it fast with the little hand machines they had. Yeah. The real cigarette rolling machine could do 200 a minute.
Wow.
And
they're
so
perfect.
Yeah, and they're perfect.
A lot of them.
So
everyone is exactly the same.
Absolutely. So making money off of that, the Duke family turned around and bought up almost every tobacco business. Anyway, so the Supreme
Court, I don't want to gloss over that because you can buy up all the businesses because you can overpay what somebody is worth. What were they when they were buying the tobacco businesses? What were they buying exactly?
So they were buying other cigarette companies. They were buying other
brands.
The brands like Raleigh and Lucky Strike. And
did they have tobacco farms or yes, they did, right?
Well, they bought up the companies that were the ones that stored and collected the tobacco. So you still might have John Smith, the farmer out there growing the tobacco, and he would sell it to
the so maybe company that would collect it. Okay, I got that.
And the guy who has the big barn somewhere in the fields in Kentucky and Maryland, that company got bought by U.S. Tobacco.
So I just think this is an important concept to talk about for a second.
Sure.
So here's a moment in time where someone comes up with an absolutely fantastic invention. And in that moment, that person, that entity can completely dominate an industry, get outsized profits. Then, and I've thought about this a lot, then after that, because I don't believe in patents or copyrights, and I pretty sure that stands up to scrutiny because I've been thinking about that for a long time too. Then somebody else figures out how to make that machine and they make a machine like that and they probably make it a little bit better. Yes, it's going to take them a while to kind of claw away some of those contracts of who's selling what tobacco to which brand that this incumbent had already bought. But over time, the really outsized profits come only in that moment that you made a big, big difference and also capitalized on that. Now, what I object to when I think of robber barons or the era of trusts and all that was some of the stuff that I've heard that Rockefeller did, for example, and maybe railroads were unscrupulous too. They got subsidies and stuff, but Rockefeller would use, if I understand this correctly, he would cheat people into, he would force them to sell to him. Even if they didn't want to, he would cheat. He would buy off governments to allow him to cheat people out of their, whatever. So that's the problem that I have with, and then put up barriers to entry so that the new guy cannot put pressure on him through innovation or competition. I mean, I don't know if he really said it or not, but competition is a sin. Definitely, I think depicts his mindset.
Yeah, examples like if there was a producer out there that wouldn't sell to one of the Rockefeller companies, he would go either put pressure on or in some cases even buy the bank that had loaned that small producer money and then call the loan. So if they really, that's the kind of stuff that the robber barons did to the ones who were really robber barons to really play hardball is they had enough money to play those kind of games and continue to consolidate the power and make it worse and worse and worse in many ways. And this is where I think reasonable people can disagree. Even libertarians can sit around over 3 or 4 beers and have an argument over at what point
When
should
you draw the line.
yeah, where
I
do you
would
draw a
say
line on it being a monopoly?
but it's not that. I would say you draw the line at the Murray Rothbard's rules, which are don't touch me or my stuff. If they're coming in and they're defrauding you or coercing you out of your rightful property and manipulating governments that you pay to protect that property, that's where you draw the line. And that's why, monopoly, in my opinion, no monopoly can exist without government support. And we can get into that, but that's definitely what I've concluded over the years.
Yeah, so if the government is involved, we definitely want to stop that and give people a chance to compete. I'm kind of go ahead.
I would just say the reason I say like no monopoly really exists because other than food and water and air and shelter and stuff, which don't have scarcity, you cannot make a monopoly of those things. Everything else has a substitute. Nothing else is a necessity. And therefore, even if one person owns an entire industry, which I don't even think would happen, even in utilities, I don't think it would happen, especially not now. But even if somebody owned an entire industry, you don't have to use it. You just don't have to use it. And anyway, that's a bigger concept for another conversation.
Yeah, and we can have another conversation.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of limited copyrights and patents, that you want somebody to get rewarded for building that cigarette machine or building the new car, and they get the benefit of that for 7 years or 14 years. But then after that, there shouldn't be the barriers to compete.
I mean, that's in the Constitution, which is pretty amazing. I mean, that's a pretty activist thing to do on a federal level. So, I mean, you're in good company. But I just over the years, I've decided, it's not for me.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court stuff, let's just kind of be clear, but I want to make sure. So in Standard Oil and the U.S. tobacco case, what ended up happening is the Supreme Court adds the test of reasonableness to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which basically means that courts can be very subjective about which monopolies they're going to break up.
Yes.
If the monopoly is so strong that it's behaving unreasonably, then it can be broken up. But if their behavior is reasonable, if they're not hurting the consumers and they haven't done something that actually really violates the law in some other way, then maybe the monopoly shouldn't be broken up. That unreasonableness was not in the law. So the court added it. So the Supreme Court basically made it harder for the government to break up monopolies, but not impossible. The next kind of Supreme Court case, this is where the tide starts to turn. It took until 1928 in the case of J.W. Hampton versus the United States. The issue there was who sets the tariffs. And remember, we had this era of high tariffs. And so what ends up happening was in 1913, we passed the income tax, another big boo, but we also passed the 16th Amendment to allow Congress to set an income tax. That was that was people sometimes refer to it as a populist amendment, also a progressive amendment. It kind of showed the sea change when the populists had gotten enough power to actually make stuff happen in the government. It became the beginning of the progressive movement. So we had this income tax. The whole idea was just to tax a tiny percentage of people. The original income tax was a 1% tax on people making the top 1% of income. So it was really, really tiny. But we didn't necessarily move tariffs down enough to allow for international competition, to allow for people to buy cheap cigarettes from Canada or Great Britain. So what ends up happening is, in this case of J.W. Hampton versus the United States, Congress writes a rule that says the president can decide the amount of tariffs. And the question
See, the
was,
tariffs are a problem. I agree with that. Go ahead.
tariffs are a problem. The question is, should the president be able to just arbitrarily set them within a range set by Congress, or does Congress, the body that's elected by the people, need to actually affirmatively say this is what the rate is? And
Definitely. I mean, taxation, it's a pivotal distinction between the European systems and the American systems, is that the taxation was in the hands of, quote, the people or the representatives of the people, and not of the head of government.
I agree 100%, but this is where the Supreme Court starts to go south. This is one of those cases where eventually, so this is 1928. So Woodrow Wilson elected in 1912, served to the end of World War One in
28.
1920, and it took till 1928
That's
before,
Calvin Coolidge.
yeah, it's and right before Hoover was elected.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, I
and
guess
this,
he didn't have control over it. It was already in motion.
so this is actually a Republican president arguing I should have the authority to set these tariffs if Congress
Was
is
he?
going to grant it to me.
Was he arguing that? Was he involved in this? Could he have just dropped the case?
So it was a company that didn't like the tariffs suing to say that the power should not have been delegated to the president of the United States, and the United States Solicitor General defended the case.
But Calvin Coolidge would
He
have
was
been
president.
aware of it and made the decision that his Solicitor General would pursue this case and not drop it.
Yeah.
Ah, that's a disappointment.
Yeah. So in this case, basically really set the foundation for the administrative state, because what the Supreme
Shoot.
Court ultimately says is, if there's a delegation of power that has an intelligible principle, you remember that from administrative law? If
Yes.
there's an intelligible principle, then Congress can delegate that power. And it gets rid of what I think you and I would probably agree is a real problem. If Congress wants to be very express and say, here's the exact factors you have to consider, and you can do it with this little narrow range, then that's something an agency might do. But if you're just going to give a general guiding principle to a bunch of bureaucrats, that might be a problem. Well, this is the case. This is the case that really, really started it. And then,
What was the name of the case again? Hampton?
this is J.W. Hampton Jr. and Company versus the United States.
Okay, sorry. I have to make notes because I need to follow up and put stuff in the show notes. So sometimes I look away, but it's on point.
All right, and so remember, so that's 1928. The next big case, other one that I think is really important that we understand historically, and this kind of finishes the story, although there's a couple things we can fill in. The switch in time that saved 9. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, that is about the Supreme Court, right?
Right. So by the mid 1930s, FDR had gotten into power, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And if you think Woodrow Wilson was a progressive that thought the government could solve problems, well, in the heart of the Depression, FDR is creating all these agencies, from the Civilian Conservation Corps to the Tennessee Valley Authority to just about anything,
Amazing.
all kinds of things that would control the prices of agriculture and control transportation. It was just, the government's going to run everything. It just, you cannot believe, by our modern standards, looking back at the stuff that he did want to do and he did, it's just really, really, amazing amount of government power that was being done during the New Deal and the stuff that FDR wanted to put in place. The case that actually came to the Supreme Court was actually not a New Deal program, but it was a case you and I talked about in a previous podcast about cases that changed the United States. This case is West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. And the issue was that Washington State had put in a minimum wage for women and children, and they considered them to be weak and in need of protection. So there wasn't a minimum wage for men, but if you wanted to hire a woman, say, to be a maid in your hotel or to be a seamstress, this was back in the 1930s, or if you were going to have child labor, there was a minimum wage set.
Of course, that means that men are favored to get the jobs, but whatever.
That means men can, if a man's willing to work for less money, then he can get the jobs. That's exactly what that means. And the Supreme Court took up this case where somebody challenged, it was actually the hotel owner saying, I shouldn't have to pay this woman a minimum wage here in Seattle. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And one of the Supreme Court justices who had consistently throughout the 1930s voted on the conservative side to limit federal government power, to follow the Constitution, to follow the Lochner line of cases that said the power to contract is protected by the Constitution. This was Justice Owen Roberts. he became the deciding vote. And what was happening at the same time was FDR had proposed a new law that would increase the size of the Supreme Court up to 15 justices.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
FDR was putting on this whole thing about how they have so much work to do and they need more help and how they can't be efficient. But what it really would have done was given him the chance to appoint 6 more
Yes,
justices,
that's
and it would
nuts.
have totally changed the and if that had gone through, think what would have happened when Republicans get back in charge. Well, they've got to appoint 9 more so that they can have more on the Supreme Court. And by today's standards, we'd have 175 people on the Supreme Court, and each person would want to add more to take the majority over. The court packing scheme is what it was called. And so Justice Roberts ended up voting in favor of government power in the case of West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. And there's a guy named Cal Tenney, who was kind of a humorist, kind of in the what was the guy's name who spun the rope all the time? The old comedian, the one from the 1930s. I'll remember his name later. But Cal Tenney was one of these vaudeville kind of humorists who was in the early radio, and he coined the time the phrase "the switch in time that saved 9." That Justice Owens switching his vote saved the count
Will
of 9 justice.
Rogers.
Yeah, Will Rogers. Cal Tenney was kind of a Will Rogers character, and he ended up quoting. He was the one that came up with that idea: switch in time that
Yeah,
saved 9.
that's good.
Just kind of big picture. I want to just kind of finish with this last thought. I'll let you ask any other questions, and I don't mean to do all the
No, it's
talking here.
perfect. It's
I like to
fantastic.
hear this. I
Love
like to
it.
have the conversation about this.
Mhm.
So when Teddy Roosevelt messed up, or Taft messed up, whoever you want to blame it on, for the 1912 election that basically handed it to Woodrow Wilson, the first Democrat to win other than Grover Cleveland since the Civil War, and he only won with 42% of the votes. That's how Woodrow Wilson came to power. That same year, the U.S. considered the 16th Amendment, which ended up passing on February 3rd, 1913. So that was the one allowing for a national income tax. On April 8th of 1913, the 17th Amendment was
About the
passed,
senators.
changing so that senators were directly
That
elected
was
by the
bad.
people. That was
Yeah.
a populist era one that hung on and lasted.
So bad.
6 years later, the 18th Amendment was prohibition. That was sort of a populist movement because so many people wanted it. And then on April 18th, 1920 was women's suffrage. All those things happened in that 7-year period. Additionally, at the same time, the first income tax was passed in 1913. The Federal Reserve was passed in 1913. The Federal Trade Commission was founded in 1913. And the
Wow.
Clayton Antitrust Act was passed in 1913 and 1914, which increased the power of the federal government to regulate industry. All of that happened in Woodrow Wilson's first. Most of that happened in his first term. All of it happened around that time period.
All right, I have to say 2 things. One is about prohibition. I have read that it was a plot by Rockefeller against Ford because Ford was going to run cars on ethanol, maybe. He was going to do it out of vegetables. And I have to defend, I actually don't think anybody's right to vote should trump the basic fundamental rights. I think voting should have little to no power whatsoever anyway, but because I believe in a highly binding foundational law. In my case, it would be don't touch me or my stuff. And I don't even think it would take much administration except for maybe a town elder to get that done. But I will say in defense
And
of
maybe
people,
a policeman or two.
maybe, or you could just defend yourself, have a packet, little open carry or concealed carry. But I know it could get ugly, but I don't think so. I think it's more about culture. But people do criticize the vote for women, and I would say yes, you can look and see how many women elected Obama or whatever, but women elected Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, who I would argue were the two. I mean, I know that there were problems in the Harding, his reputation, but he prevented the Depression and FDR reforms that they had to wait another decade. They being those who want this big government stuff and socialism and everything. I mean, those two won by the biggest landslide in U.S. presidential history, and I would argue that's because of the women.
Yeah, I'd look at Nixon too. He won by such a big landslide in
And was it
'72.
mostly
I,
women?
I don't know if it was mostly women. That's worth looking up, but I wouldn't be surprised because
Those were the two number 1 and number 2, Nixon and Reagan. I don't know about Nixon, but Reagan was a big one.
Yeah, we'll have to look at Nixon because he actually won like the biggest
In
percentage of popular vote
1972,
in
which was
72. Yeah.
after Watergate was completely vetted by the media, after. So he had
He
to
was still
resign.
denying it. Yeah.
Well, he didn't do it. Nobody ever accused him of doing it, but he did lie about what he knew after the fact. That was
Yeah.
the only malfeasance I think he was even ever accused of. And despite knowing about Watergate and not knowing what his role was, he was still elected by a tremendous landslide in 1972. That just goes to show you that muckraking yellow journalism can really undermine the will of the people. I'm not a fan of Nixon, all the things he did from open China to some war atrocities, the drug war, everything. But whatever,
Yeah, I'm with
he
you. I'm
was
not a
elected.
big fan too. The kind of what's going on today answer about this. I know you and I would certainly like to see less federal government, even significantly less. This is now playing these same arguments that were happening in 1912, 1915, and then again in the 1930s. We're now seeing a generation after the really massive increase in the administrative state in the late 20th century, the Supreme Court starting to turn the other way. And the case I would point to that shows a little sign of hope for those of us who are opposed to a big administrative state was the recent case of EPA versus West Virginia.
Oh,
That
yes, let's
yeah,
talk about that.
so that in that case, the federal government had, under the Environmental Protection Agency, under the Obama administration, they had proposed regulations that instead of regulating the pollution that would be output by a single power plant, they issued regulations that would cap the total amount of pollution of all power plants combined and set a cap of what percentage of power plants could be coal, what could be oil, what could be natural gas, and then eventually there had to be only a certain they have to be wind and solar, and these other percentages are going down. The problem with that, and then just a quick background was so Obama put that out. It was going through. It was being challenged in the courts. Trump comes in, reverses the policy, and then as soon as he loses in 2020, Biden comes in and reinstates the Obama plan, and it very quickly gets to the Supreme Court, where the federal government's official position is that we're going to start shutting down power plants around the United States because they're using coal or oil as their ways of production. And the technical argument that we as lawyers would be making here is the Environmental Protection Act only allows the government to regulate the pollution being created by this individual power plant, the one that's right there in San Jose or the one that's right there in Nashville, not the collective pollution of the entire United States. The Supreme Court, the majority opinion, ultimately agreed with that and said that this regulation is beyond the power of the Environmental Protection Agency because Congress did not delegate to the administrative agency the power to regulate the whole industry in the United States. They can only regulate what each plant does. And the interesting dissent that Justice Kagan wrote, very interestingly, clearly says that there are some things that are beyond the expertise of Congress, that Congress doesn't understand just how dangerous this pollution can be. We're facing an environmental disaster. And I think the quote was, there's some things Congress cannot know and should not know that are being done. That it's up to these experts in these agencies to do that. It's not within the expertise of Congress to regulate these things. So we should read the powers given to these expert technocrats at the administrative level very broadly and should not treat the Constitution as a limit. Now, I think you and I would agree she's nuts, but that's exactly the same reasoning that was being used by Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens.
Yes, that sounds exactly like it echoes that. But I would also, just from the libertarian point of view, point out that Murray Rothbard wrote during the Industrial Revolution in England, the courts were suspending the rights of individual property owners to stop pollution from encroaching on their land. So they would, and it was serious. So they would have ash on their land so thick that moths changed colors or something. Like, there was a lot of pollution, and the government said it's too much of in the interest of this country to have industry build up. So we are going to suspend your ability to sue for this encroachment on your private property. So I would say pollution is trespass. So you would not need that kind of regulation, and you don't need to talk about industry wise. You can literally trace one company polluting on your property, and just use a traditional method, even if it's just tort. So I disagree with her on many levels.
I actually made that argument to my administrative law professor one time in
Wow.
class, that exact
Yeah.
argument, that the private right of action of the people who are being polluted on is what should be the response. You don't need administrative agencies to do that. And I got so poo-pooed.
And it
And it
was
was
stopped, though. The reason it never worked is because it was not allowed. And that's why. So they would
it,
want to say to you, well, why didn't it work? And I'm according to Murray
it,
Rothbard, who I think was quite a
because
good researcher.
it was government overreach, right? So actually, we're going to see what's happening right now in Ohio with, as these suits go through. It's just going to be that kind of thing. So one last, I think, important distinction. I keep saying last because I'm not sure how much longer you want to go. But
I definitely have time. Not a ton. At least 15 minutes if you want to keep going. It's fine.
let me defend the founding fathers a little bit and respond to some of the stuff that Woodrow Wilson said. So Woodrow Wilson's whole idea, a lot of these arguments that he made as an early political scientist, was that the Constitution should stretch, it should be elastic, it should be a living document, it should not be a hindrance to the will of the people, it should be adjustable for the age. It was written in an era of agriculture and slow communications and slow transportation, and that the principles behind it can be ignored because we live in a different era. And I think the absolute argument why that's wrong, in my defense of the founding fathers, is that the founding fathers didn't write the Constitution with the separation of powers because they were a small population with a lot of agriculture. They wrote it because they understand human beings. They understand that human beings are political animals, and that if you give human beings too much power, they're going to abuse that power. It's just naturally what's going to happen. As government grows, people are going to abuse that power. And so their fundamental principle was not one based on the stuff that it was really these straw men set up by Woodrow Wilson to attack the founding fathers, when in fact the founding fathers had a really good point, that it was the immutable characteristic of human beings, that self-interest and the potential to become corrupt is what we need to guard against. Woodrow Wilson argued that in the modern era, that human beings are going to continue to improve in their social relations, and therefore we don't need these guards of limited government. We can just trust ththese people to do it. Now we'll skip ahead. What happened in the 20th century, and especially and then even now, these administrative agencies are not full of people who are politically uninterested. They're not full of people who are just doing what they want to do because they think it's the best academically a good idea. They're politically motivated. Our institutions, our administrative agencies are full of people that have a political agenda.
Not only a political agenda, but conflicts of interest up the wazoo. Like, I always have to see which one is worse, their political ideology and their brainwashing, or who they're in bed with. And I would say 9 out of 10 times they think to themselves, I'm doing good for humanity, I should get a little extra on the side. So it combines. But I will say Ben Franklin, I think, was, for example, as a founding figure, was very, very prescient in his expectation of how we would grow and how we would live and where the population would go and how technology would advance. And I think that's why he did things like, I believe he lay Philadelphia out on a grid, which was absolutely anticipated a future that wasn't about getting cows to the town center through a spoke and wheel thing like Boston. So I would say that they built this country with fully expecting that it would be something much, much larger and more complex. And that is why it would work so well. It would really work so well still. It's amazing.
I don't think they had any idea what technology was going to do over time. I think they did realize it was going to grow. They hoped it was going to grow. But I think the most important thing they brought to the table was the recognition that you could look at the big British Empire and their bureaucracy and their corruption and the history of kings and the history of parliament and the history. Because remember, for these guys at the founding fathers, the whole Glorious Revolution and the whole history of Great Britain in the 1600s was only 100 years ago. That was common knowledge type history. The whole, where Charles got beheaded and Oliver Cromwell and that whole era. They knew what kind of things could happen if you put too much power in the hands of a small number of people or an individual. and that human nature was not going to change. What Woodrow Wilson's big mistake was, where he's wrong, I believe, is he thought you could put these people into these administrative agencies and that they would somehow be honest experts who would only worry about their little area of expertise and would not be influenced by either greed or corruption or their own politics.
Which is crazy. And I don't believe he could possibly have been mistaken about that. I think he had to have known, he's just too smart not to know that someone was going to control the agenda.
But Monica, it's the 20th century. We have cars and airplanes and electricity. Everything's getting better. Why are you standing in the way of progress?
Right. Well, I mean, these guys, I do think that they still to this day, the people who have that kind of want centralized power, want ideology of that nature, they promote hard to manage complexity and then use the concept of hard to manage complexity to give themselves power. And I would say the financial system is the primary example of that. So whatever. But okay, so yeah, let's we do have a little more time, so why don't you tell me what you think is the long term, what's going on now that are they going to be reversed? Is Clarence Thomas going to come to the rescue? What are we looking at here?
It's not just Clarence Thomas. I think it's all 6 justices are now willing to consider that some things by the administrative agencies go too far. The West Virginia versus EPA case is a good example. The one about the mandating the vaccine, although it was disappointing, the turnaround that they did say that mandating the vaccine in places that receive Medicare and Medicaid was a problem. So it's not over yet. I think Justice Roberts is a little bit too much of a compromiser, a little bit too worried about the reputation of the court. But I think with the other conservatives that are on the court, we're going to see somewhat of a sea change. It took from the founding basically through the 1930s to have Supreme Court justices who were kind of strictly following the Constitution. But by the 1930s, the political pressure had been enough to put these people on the Supreme Court that were not worried about the Constitution so much and were more worried about practical realities. That's when you started getting decisions where they think, like, one of the factors of whether a law is constitutional or not is whether it's a good idea. You got the famous Justice O'Connor in the 1980s statement that in order to decide if a law is unconstitutional or not, you look at a set of factors, and only one of the factors is whether it violates the Constitution or not. What happened in America is from the 1930s until the early 2000s is it sort of became accepted in law schools. It became accepted politically that we had grown to be such a big country. We had grown to be this different society that we just don't look strictly at the Constitution. And there were enough people still hanging in there. There were enough people still saying, wait a minute. We have a separation of powers. We have limited powers under Article 1 in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, that's the list of what Congress can do.
Yes.
You can't go beyond that list.
Enumerated powers.
Right. And if you look in the 1990s, we had the first case in a very long time, the one about guns in school zones, where the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, that's not one of the listed powers. You can't regulate that. And you didn't even cite which one of the listed powers you were going to rely on. And so the Supreme Court threw out that law. You started to see glimmers of the Supreme Court starting to change, where it was starting to follow the Constitution again. Now, all of a sudden, we've got 5 solid, maybe 6 willing conservative justices. And it's why you're seeing the political class, especially on the left, being so critical of the Supreme Court that if they don't rule a certain way, we're going to reap the whirlwind or release the whirlwind or whatever Chuck Schumer said. That it's no big deal. People go protest in front of Supreme Court justice's house, despite the fact that it's actually against the law to try to influence a judicial decision by threat of force. They just don't care about that. And so they are talking about packing the Supreme Court again. It's what the left doesn't like, the fact that our Supreme Court might be turning back toward a more traditional reading of the Constitution with limited powers. How much it's going to change? These are big questions that you and I are going to see.
What do you think? Like, what does your gut tell you? What's the maximum? What do you hope to see? What could you possibly expect, in your personal opinion?
I think it's gonna. I get a very practical answer. If the next president is a Republican and has good advisors on who to pick for their nominees,
your money's on DeSantis.
Maybe. So I mean, I like Tim Scott a lot.
Oh, really?
But I wouldn't trust
Really?
Tim. I wouldn't trust either Tim Scott or DeSantis to necessarily put the right people on the Supreme Court on their
Well,
own.
think of the Florida Surgeon General.
Yeah, I think DeSantis would be
I
probably
could
pretty good at
swoon.
it. If Nikki Haley somehow comes out of the mess,
Oh, she's
as
past her prime. Did you hear that? Don Lemon said
I
that,
heard,
and he's older than she is.
yeah, he's 56 and he's like
Yeah,
5 years older. But
yeah.
Monica, if you know Don Lemon, you'll understand that women age much faster than men, and their prime is much younger. And you know how he knows that? Because he Googled it. That was his answer
Oh
when
my god.
how do
I
you know
think
what a
that whole
woman's
thing,
prime is? He said, I Googled it.
they just feed him these lines to create controversy. Probably a little PR stunt.
Yeah, yeah, maybe
So,
so.
yeah, so Nikki Haley, okay, so you like this.
So
So you think if they've got good advisors as what to put in place
people from the
the
Federalist Society,
Department
people
of
who have
Justice or what?
if when the next Supreme Court nominee, somebody it needs to be somebody from the federal. It's not going to happen under a Democrat administration, but if the Republicans, uh, win and they get the right people in there, it's possible because the age of everybody. I think Clarence Thomas makes it to the next term for sure before he retires. Some of the other ones are going to be there for a while. If we have a Republican who goes and to the to the well of people who have been members of the Federalist Society for a long time, we could end up with 6 or 7 solid conservatives on the Supreme Court for a while. And if the Republicans can keep in power enough to at least maintain a divided government so that we don't end up ever packing the Supreme Court, I think there's a realistic opportunity the Supreme Court could claw the United States back into an era where we follow the Constitution a lot more. It's also going to help if we get a lot more people that understand these issues. Unfortunately, it became too much of a common understanding of the way the world works in the late 20th century that we just don't look at little things like the rules in the Constitution. We're just looking at the big picture and what's good for America and what's good for the country.
See, I do fear, and this is me down in the rabbit hole, but some of my fears have come to pass. Things like Roe versus Wade or just anything that might be considered the success of a new term I discovered is reactionary. I didn't know that this is what this means. So there's revolutionary who wants to change things, and there's reactionary which wants to change it back.
That was
So
the people that
yeah,
got thrown in the gulag and that got hung in the
we're
1920s and 30s in Russia were the reactionaries,
okay, right.
the ones that tried to slow the revolution down. Do
Okay,
you
very good.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid that if this stuff gets perceived as reactionary, it could actually spark a constitutional convention or try to repeal the constitution that the progressives, let's call them that, global progressives, the international, communist party or whatever, has such a foothold now that they would use the any success the reactionaries have as a foundation for reinvigorating the revolution.
You'd have to throw out the Constitution altogether.
That's what I'm saying. I think
Yeah.
that's what they want to do.
I think well, I agree with that I'm very concerned about that. I just don't think I'm hopeful that it's such a small number of people that it's not going to continue to be so scary that we're going to throw out the Constitution. I mean, think about what's the premise of the 1619 Project, that the United States was founded on slavery in order to. That's why we have the
Right.
Declaration of Independence. It's bullshit. But it's the kind of propaganda you need to spread around if you're going to get people to stop believing in the Constitution. That's why I think they're doing this kind of stuff. That's a lot of what I think the woke identity politics stuffs, that the hate America, that the founding fathers were all slave owners. It's to undermine the legacy that we have as Americans of the bright ideas and the solid reasoning behind the Constitution and the founding of this country. They want to undermine all that so that you're right that they can try to throw it out. I just think
And
America's stronger than that. That's my
here's the problem is that the answer is, was it a triumph of the individual and liberty and justice in theory? Did it in practical application work to effect what it promised? And isn't the problem that it didn't deal with the slavery problem that basically it inherited, did not cover every single person in those protections, and isn't the answer to to make those protections universal? Isn't the answer like women's suffrage? Like, isn't the answer to expand the protections to where it actually does protect everyone? Or is the answer to throw the baby out with bathwater, to just cycle through who the face jobs of tyranny are, and just, there it was Bastiat in the law who said, and I can never find this actual quote, I'll have to reread the whole darn thing. Basically, beware of just switching places with your oppressors and then being the oppressors yourself. Like, you have to understand that these basic principles are in place because, and I was absolutely raised on this, there but for the grace of God go I. And every time I look at elitists who want injustice at the individual level, I feel like they must be so confident that neither they nor their children will ever be at the bottom, or they don't actually care about their children, that they're willing to take those chances. They feel so secure that they will never have to take the brunt of a truly unjust society. And those of us who fight for these individual protections, or even recognize them, recognize that they are meant to protect every single solitary individual, no matter how, the circumstances of your birth. And that's why poor people from all around the world always wanted to emigrate here, because the promise is that equal protection. And yes, it was a failing, but it is a mistake, I think, to just try to bring, communism or tyranny, stuff that doesn't work and really hurts more people.
So first response, I think we have already gone a long way to do that. The founding fathers were left in there was no other country in the world that had given the women the right to vote in 1789. And most other countries that had slavery, they weren't getting rid of it in 1789. That was the compromise we had to do at the time. And then I like the idea of the post-Civil War amendments basically being the second founding, that the 14th Amendment is what guaranteed those rights to everybody else. However, some ultra conservative Southern justices still in the Supreme Court with the slaughterhouse cases really cutting back into the 14th Amendment. And then
We've talked about that. It's very
yep.
interesting. Yeah, I do. I respect your opinion on it.
And then also Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s, kind of indoctrinating separate but equal. And that happened a long time. But then by the 1950s and 60s, we actually, using the language that were the promises of the founding fathers, we fixed all that. And we've been making all these changes to make the country work for everybody. And that's why you're right. We have people wanting to move here. But I think one of the things that we just don't do is we don't educate the young people in what has America done right? What did Martin Luther King actually accomplish? What did we get done with the Brown versus Board of Education case and some of the other cases that followed that? How that America actually started living up to its promise. And where you and I were born. I mean, you were born, but a few minutes ago.
Sure, I'm older than you, Eric.
But in our lifetime, we were born in that time period where that stuff had already happened, and those issues had gone away. Now some people are trying to bring them back to stir up trouble to get rid of the Constitution. And I think
Right.
I think you're dead on right that people just don't see the possibility that if the rule I want to enforce was applied against me, that's even possible.
Yes.
The other possibility I would add to what you just said is it's not that they don't think it can happen to their kids, it's that they don't think about it, that they haven't thought it through, that they're so naive that they see the system working pretty well right now. They can't imagine that some kind of tyranny can actually really happen, that the system could collapse. It's the idea that you keep tearing at the system, and then you're shocked when the system falls down. They're tearing at the system because they can't see themselves outside of this system that's always worked. They just always have taken advantage of it. And I have a real problem with modern progressives and their ideas.
And you're right about the education, the simplicity with which people airbrush or take a broad brush strokes as to what are the causes. I mean, I hear these, I have teenagers, I hear them and their friends talking about, just this BS platitude stuff that comes from TikTok. I mean, just nonsense.
Why do we even need money, Monica?
Soundbite. Yeah, exactly. Stuff like that. And then, saying they're communist and then, getting hysterical because I'm not vaccinated. It's just like, okay, that's a capitalist plot. I don't want to call it a capitalist plot, but it's definitely a plot. It's a fascist plot. That's for sure. In my opinion. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, Eric, but I feel like that you're absolutely 100% right. It's the lack of education, it's the lack of critical thinking, and I actually think that that is greatest in these privileged, kind of upper middle class public schools and stuff, because when I was in Atlanta and I used to have people from all walks of life, all races, ethnicities, immigrant status, calling from different ideological backgrounds, they were highly critical of these blanket claims and stereotypes and stuff that the politicians would make. And even if you talk to people about 9/11 from other countries, they can actually have a discussion with you and not tell you to shut up, conspiracy theorist, whatever. They understand that there's like possible evidence and all of that. Yeah, so I totally agree that it comes to just a very simplistic and erroneous and agenda propaganda driven education on these kids, which is absolutely made worse by the media 100%. Like the fact that this social media, we could go on, and I always do. So I'm going to stop right now. If there's anything else that you have to say, Eric, like throw it in there now, and then we're going to wrap it up.
No, thanks for this opportunity. This was great. Always enjoy talking to you,
Ah,
Monica. This is
and
fun stuff.
you just really are so good at it. It's like such a privilege to hear it's comprehensive, and I know I make you like stop the flow to assert my ideological challenges to some of the more pragmatic statements that you make, but I love it. It's such a joy, and I can't wait till next time. Do we have a topic for next time?
We can talk. I am kind of interested in the later 20th century progressivism slash big government bureaucracy. We just kind of talk about, keep working through how we got here. Um,
Great.
the Justice O'Connors of the world. I think it eventually, where it wasn't like this, I don't think intentional desire. It was just going with the flow, just being okay with ignoring the Constitution. I think is what
Yes.
happened in the 70s. Even Nixon. I think Nixon was one of the worst instigators
Or
when it came to ignoring the Constitution. You had this
yes.
one little bright light with Reagan, and even he had his some significant flaws. But when I mean, some of the justices he appointed were such big disappointments.
I know.
Somehow the one president that most people think is the most unconstitutional is the one that actually appointed the most Supreme Court justices who are going to support the Supreme Court. Well, we can kind of talk about that later. I
That's a
think,
great idea. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And I
it's
was
kind
raised by a man who was absolutely hyper vigilant about the details, to the point where he was like, government should not do scientific research. It's against the Constitution. And look where we are today. They've completely monopolized scientific research and politicized it, and of course neutralized it, in my opinion.
Speaking of science, can I give a shout out? Clint and I and our friend Matthew Durham just did a show this week. If you look at for during the break or of by and for the people, we did a deep dive into Lysenkoism. Have you ever heard of Minister Lysenko? He was the Soviet Minister of Agriculture in the 1930s and 40s under Stalin. He probably contributed to the death of 25 million people. He was the one who rejected science-based agriculture and went with these really kooky theories, including if you plant a bunch of the same similar kind of wheat that's not the same but different types of wheat, and you plant it way closer together than you normally will, it'll do great because they're all in the same class and they will support each other. It was the classist approach to growing wheat, and it ended up, of course, none of the wheat
Yeah.
survived. It was
Wow.
absolutely horrible. He had a bunch of other kooky theories. Part of, just to summarize up his life, is he was responsible for about 3,000 Russian Soviet scientists either being sent to prison, being hung, or at least losing their jobs and having no more income because they were scientists. And the premise of Lysenkoism is when you allow your science to become totally
Yes.
infected with
Yeah.
ideology and politics, you end up with this horrible disaster. What ultimately happened is his ideas were exported to China when China turned communist. And between 58 and 62, 55 million people
Yeah.
died using his ideas. That's where their big famine came from.
Great leap
And
forward. Wow.
and what I would submit, what Clinton Matthew and I talked about, was if you look at some of the stuff that's happening today in the academy in science and how they are infecting scientific theories with these political and ideological ideas, like the vaccine should be distributed according to race and not according to age or vulnerability, is just one small example. It's worth it. It's a
Don't
good deep
throw
dive
that in
into.
there, Eric.
Yeah.
We can argue for an hour on that. Okay, so would you please? I'm gonna hop after the outro, but if you could please send me an email with all the links, anything that you have from today's show, but also the link to that show. I'll put it in the show notes, which people can find at monicasdeepdives.com. And I would like to thank you, Eric, as always, for your time. I really look forward to the next one, and also put a link to how people can reach you if they do have want to use your services or get a referral from you. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Deep Dives with Monica Perez.